Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Fishing with James. This is episode 4 of my hand-tied jig series, and today I'll be showing you how to tie a crappie jig that I call Baby Bass. And at the end of this video, I'll be throwing it in my fish tank to give you all some underwater footage. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started, and as always, everything you'll need to tie this jig can be found in the description of this video. The jig head I'll be using today is a half and half black and white ProTech painted jig head. I've also gone ahead and stuck some 6mm eyes on the side of this jig. So to start out, we're going to lay a thin line of super glue from the jig head all the way about to the point of the hook and wipe up any excess. Next, we're going to take our thread, and even with the point of the hook, we're going to wrap all the way up to the head of the jig and back down some just to make sure we get a nice little layer of thread built up on the jig. Next, we're going to take our scissors and snip off the tagging of the thread. The belly of this jig is going to be white, so I've taken and trimmed a small section of white marabou feather and wet it between my fingers so it'll be easier to use. We're going to lay it down on the jig, and once we have it where we want it, we're going to take a loose loop of thread and wrap all the way down to 2/3 of the way to the hook point. Then we're going to go all the way back up to the head of the jig and set our thread off to the side. Next, we're going to take a similarly sized piece of green marabou feather and do the same thing as we did with the white feather. We're going to lay it down on the jig and size it up to make sure the length is correct. Once we've done that, again, a very loose loop of thread so it doesn't yank the feather off to the side too much. And we're going to wrap down to, again, 2/3 of the way to the hook point, and then go back up to the head of the jig and set our thread off to the side. It's at this point that I go ahead and make sure my feathers are exactly as I want them, and I pull them out and make sure that they extend to the same length. Now we're going to take a piece of red tinsel cut in half and even it up at the head of the jig. Then we're going to take our thread and wrap it down to the same point that we are after our feathers. I'm holding it at the same point as the feathers here to make sure it stays on the bottom where I want it. Then we're going to wrap back up to the head of the jig. It's at this point that I'll trim the tinsel to make sure it's even with the feathers, careful not to cut any of the feather tips. Now it's time to start working on the body. So I'm going to take a piece of white chenille and make sure it lays even on the bottom of the jig and wrap it down to the same point I wrapped the feathers and go back up to the head of the jig. Now I'm going to take the white chenille and pull it past the head of the jig, making sure that there's no feathers stuck to it, and I'm going to measure out a small distance past the head of the jig. About right there will work. Now I'm going to take my scissors and trim it right there. Once we've trimmed it, I'm going to take my fingers and pull off any small fuzzy bits of the chenille at the end that want to come off. And now we're going to move on to the actual body color, which is green and black. So the same as the white chenille, I'm going to take this chenille and wrap it down to the same point as I've wrapped everything else, again about 2/3 of the way down to the hook point. I'm going to make sure that I don't get any feathers caught up in it. Once I get it wrapped down there, I'm going to go back up to the head of the jig and set my thread off to the side again. Now I'm going to use the rotary function on my vise to slowly begin wrapping the green and black chenille up to the head of the jig. Since this chenille is a little bit thinner, I'm going to do a few layers just to get it to the thickness that I want it to get to. Once I get it to that point, I'm going to go ahead and stop at the head of the jig. Now I'm going to take my thread and cinch the chenille down to the jig by going underneath it. Then I'm going to do one wrap by the head, another wrap up underneath the chenille, another wrap by the head, one more wrap underneath the chenille, and then just a few more wraps of thread by the head of the jig. Now I'm just going to take my scissors and trim that chenille as close to the body of the jig as I can without damaging it, and pull off any little fuzzy bits that come out. Now to make the belly of the jig, we're going to take our white chenille that we tied off earlier and pull it to the head of the jig. It's very important to make sure that this stays centered, and it's very easy for it to get pulled off to either side, so make sure to work slowly so this doesn't happen. We're going to take a very loose loop of thread and cinch it down to the jig. You can see it moved a little bit, so I'm going to pull it back up into place and continue to do this with every loop of thread that I do until it gets tight on the jig. So the second loop, we're going to again do the same, make sure it stays even, and now we're going to hold it and cinch it, and now we're just going to do more wraps to get it down tight. Right here, I'm just doing some really fine adjustments because I want this to be exactly down the middle. Now we're just going to take our thread and cinch it down to the jig, and after that, we're going to take our scissors and trim the white chenille as close to the body of the jig again without damaging it. Now most of the time you can pull these fuzzy bits out with your fingers, but sometimes it's a little bit harder to do, but it can be fixed just by wrapping them into the jig with the thread a few more times. There we go. To finish off this jig, all we have to do is a simple whip finish, and once we've done a few loops around the jig, all we have to do is pop the thread out right there, pull it tight to the jig, pop that hook out, and now just take the scissors and trim that thread one more time. And there you have it. the baby bass crappie jig. Now make sure to stick around because I'll be showing you all some underwater footage of this jig in just a moment, but first I just wanted to make sure that you could get a very close-up look at the jig and what it's supposed to look like whenever it's finished. So with all that said, let's head over to the fish tank and take a look at this thing underwater. So as you can see, every small little movement makes these feathers dance a ton, and look at all the action it produces, even with the slightest little taps of the rod. I know especially in ponds, crappie love to eat bass fry, and that's what I was going for with this jig. So if you stuck around until now, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Again, if you are new, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with a friend that you think would enjoy this jig. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next episode of Hand Tied Jigs.